Today we're going to be talking about PTSD versus complex PTSD. What do they have in common, and what's different between them? Hi everyone. PTSD is a well-known psychological condition that occurs in response to a traumatic event. But there have been a number of researchers and clinicians over the years who've suggested that there are a subset of people with PTSD symptoms who experience something called complex PTSD. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the characteristics of PTSD and complex PTSD and what they share in common and some of the important differences between the two. But before I get into that, just a couple of disclaimers to go over. I'm a registered psychologist in the province of British Columbia, Canada, and this video is for informational purposes only. It is not intended as a substitute or replacement for advice from your doctor or mental health professional. Now, with those things out of the way, let's start talking about the differences and similarities between PTSD and complex PTSD. Now, I've done videos on the characteristics and symptoms of PTSD and complex PTSD, but today we're going to be comparing and contrasting the two. Now, the thing with both PTSD and complex PTSD is that they both result from a person experiencing a traumatic event, following which that person experiences a constellation of symptoms that's referred to as post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, the nature of the traumatic event is one of the first distinguishing features between PTSD and complex PTSD. Common events that can trigger PTSD include things like motor vehicle accidents, sexual violence, sexual assault, physical assaults, industrial accidents, natural disasters, terrorist attacks, the sudden death of a loved one, those types of things. They're usually, but not always the case, singular events. Now, complex PTSD tends to be associated with ongoing trauma that tends to last for months or even years. These are prolonged events, repeated events from which the individual who's the victim can't escape. These types of traumatic events often occur in childhood, but they can also occur later in life as well. So, examples of some of these types of traumatic events include things like childhood neglect, repeated childhood sexual or physical abuse, domestic violence, torture, being a prisoner of war, experiencing human trafficking, prostitution, living in a region affected by war or genocide, those types of things. Now, one of the key features about all these types of traumatic events in complex PTSD is that they usually involve some form of interpersonal violence, some act of aggression or malevolence or harm inflicted by one person against another. Usually in situations when the victim is vulnerable or defenseless. Now, this can be the case in PTSD as well, but PTSD can also include accidental traumatic events in which no one individual is responsible for harm occurring, that there's no malevolence or ill will behind it. So things like natural disasters or accidents that just happen. Whereas in complex PTSD, the trauma exposure tends to be more prolonged and repeated, and you don't necessarily see that as much in PTSD. So once a person has experienced these traumatic events, they can then experience a constellation of symptoms that's characteristic of post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, this constellation of symptoms involves 4 clusters of symptoms. And the first is re-experiencing symptoms. So these are things like intrusive memories and thoughts, about the traumatic event. Nightmares, flashbacks, emotional distress or psychological reactions, feelings of panic when triggered by reminders of the traumatic event. A person will experience avoidance symptoms. The avoidance cluster of symptoms include putting efforts into trying not to think about or to talk about the traumatic events. Avoiding situations, places, or activities that may bring up reminders of the traumatic events. Those types of things. The third cluster of symptoms that you see in post-traumatic stress disorder are negative changes in thoughts and mood symptoms. So things like feelings of self-blame or emotional numbing, a sense of detachment or disconnection from other people, a loss of interest or pleasure in activities that you used to enjoy doing, strong negative beliefs about yourself, other people, the world more generally, those types of things. And finally, the fourth cluster of symptoms in post-traumatic stress disorder include hyperarousal symptoms. So things like difficult to control anger or irritability, hyper-awareness, hyper-vigilance to your environment, being easily startled, concentration problems, sleep difficulties, those types of things. So the thing is, these symptoms occur in both PTSD and complex PTSD. The difference is, in complex PTSD, the individual tends to experience other clusters of symptoms that are essentially, one way of thinking about them is magnified or supercharged versions of those negative changes in thoughts and mood symptoms that I talked about. So in complex PTSD, you tend to see more interpersonal problems like social or interpersonal avoidance. The person tends to avoid relationships. They may feel more distant or cut off from other people, or may never feel close to another person at all. The person may also experience high levels of interpersonal sensitivity in which their feelings are easily hurt, potentially leading to angry outbursts or difficulties in their interpersonal relationships. Another cluster of symptoms that you tend to see more intensely in complex PTSD relates to how a person views themselves. That the person will view themselves as broken, defeated, worthless. They may experience strong feelings of shame or failure related to the traumatic events. The person may experience a change in how they perceive themselves, feeling totally different from other people due to those strong feelings of shame and guilt. They may see themselves as contaminated or evil. They may lose a sense of their core beliefs of who they are, their values, their religious faith, or hope in the world or other people. And now the third cluster of symptoms that you tend to see more intensely in complex PTSD involves what's called emotional dysregulation. And in emotional dysregulation, a person has difficulty managing or controlling their emotions and their emotional reactions. So this can lead to self-destructive behaviors like excessive risk-taking or self-harming behaviors. This may be driven by a sense of self-hatred or just a general ambivalence about life. I just don't really care. They may experience extreme mood swings, fluctuating between periods of intense anger or sadness, or to feelings of hopelessness, to feelings of despair. So the key differences between complex PTSD and PTSD relate to the nature of the traumatic events, in that complex PTSD tends to involve more sort of prolonged or repeated trauma. And complex PTSD also tends to come with sort of more intense clusters of avoidance or of mood and interpersonal difficulty symptoms. So things like difficulties in relationships, alterations in the person's perception of themselves, that they view themselves as broken, damaged, fundamentally different from other people, and those difficulties in regulating and managing their emotional states. Now, it's notable that even with these differences between complex PTSD and PTSD, the treatment doesn't really differ between the two. And I've posted a number of videos about the treatment of PTSD, and so I'd encourage you to take a look at some of those if you're interested in learning more about how PTSD gets treated. But in brief, for both complex PTSD and PTSD, we tend to approach them the same way from a cognitive behavioral therapy perspective. So treatment components like doing cognitive exposure to the trauma memories, challenging sort of stuck points or maladaptive beliefs and assumptions that resulted from the traumatic events, and exposure to avoided situations that have resulted from the traumatic events. So I hope that makes sense. I hope that gives you a better idea of some of the similarities and differences between PTSD and complex PTSD. I'd love to hear your questions and thoughts about this, so please leave me some comments in the comments section down below. If you've been enjoying my videos and would like to see more, please hit that subscribe button and notification bell, and you'll be alerted every week when I post a new video. So that's all for today's video. As always, thank you for making it all the way to the end of this video, and I will see you in the next one.